Hello, welcome to the Persuasive Faith channel. My name is Rick Harvey, and I am the teacher of an adult class at Trinity Baptist Church in Norman, Oklahoma, in which we explore questions and objections which people might have as to the credibility of the Christian faith. We call it Persuasive Faith. This is a one-year-long class that we provide for the members of our church, and we are now in our 6th year of providing the class. Of course, normally we meet in a classroom setting, but due to the current coronavirus restrictions, we are now, at least temporarily we hope, meeting online, and we are using the Zoom format to facilitate that. Of course, the Zoom program makes it quite easy to make a video of the class, which we are doing, and then making that video available online to members of the class who may have missed a class or who wish to repeat some material, or to anyone else who might enjoy the class. I have edited the video down to include only the instructional portion of our time. Incidentally, we also have a website at persuasivefaith.org where you can access an audio podcast of all of our lessons throughout the year, as well as other things like class handouts and other resources. I hope you'll find this video informative and worthwhile, and if you do, don't hesitate to hit the like button so that other people on YouTube can know that there's material here that they might also find beneficial. So God bless, and here's today's video. Recommended sources, those are basically the same ones I had for you last week, so I won't go through those and talk about those. Now, when we talk with people about the crucifixion and the resurrection, given the fact of the crucifixion that we talked about a couple weeks ago, there are a number of facts around the life of Jesus, the followers of Christ, the church. There are a number of facts that follow, or events or phenomena that follow on the death of Christ that really beg for an explanation, okay? So, for example, there were multiple, what we call post-mortem appearances or post-mortem experiences. So a number of people had experiences with Christ where they believed that they were seeing the actual physical risen Christ. And there are numerous cases of those. There is the empty tomb. How do you account for the empty tomb? And actually, one of the things that's interesting about the empty tomb is that 75% of scholars, so Jesus historical scholars, of all persuasions, atheists, agnostics, Christians, whatever, 75% of the relevant scholars today acknowledge that the tomb was empty. And that's not a guess, actually. That's actually calculated. There's a guy, I'll mention him here in a few minutes, a Christian scholar from out east, who has actually surveyed the writings and the positions of every Jesus scholar on the questions that we're going to be talking about today. And he's actually calculated that 75% of them actually believe that the tomb was empty. And there are actually several reasons why, in addition to just the testimony of the scripture, they do that, is because, for example, the tomb itself was located in Jerusalem. Okay? So if in fact there were claims that the tomb was empty, it would have been very easy to verify whether or not the tomb was actually empty or whether or not it was a false claim, and historians recognize that. The fact that the primary witnesses to the empty tomb were women, of course, introduces that element of embarrassment. And so it would have been highly unlikely that if they made the story up, they would have used women as their evidence. And historians recognize that. And also just the tacit acknowledgement of the enemies of Christianity who wanted to disprove Christianity, that they acknowledged that the tomb was empty, and they try to account for why the tomb was empty. And so the vast majority of scholars studying in the field recognize that the tomb was empty. How do you account for the empty tomb? Third is the widespread belief in the early church of Jesus' bodily resurrection. This goes back to what we were talking about last week. How do you account for that, given that the disposition of first century people, both Jews and the Greco-Roman world, was that, well, of course, with the Greco-Roman world, the resurrection did not happen. With the Jews, it would happen at the end of the age, but certainly not at this point. So how do you account for the fact that you have this idea within the early church of this physical resurrection? What caused so many people to so quickly change their view and their understanding of resurrection? In addition to that, we have the tradition or creed that's quoted in 1 Corinthians 15, and we'll cover that in more detail here in a few minutes. Well, I guess we'll do it now. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking to the Corinthians, he's writing about the middle of about 55 AD or so, 54, 55 AD. And he says, "For I delivered to you of first importance what I also received." And the point that he's making there is that what he delivered to them when he came to Corinth, which is earlier, that something that he himself had received. And when scholars talk about that, they believe that he's referring to his return to Jerusalem after his conversion. So he travels to Damascus. He's converted in Damascus. He spends 3 years in, or a brief period of time he spends in the desert. And at some point in that time frame, he returns to Jerusalem and he hobnobs with Peter and the apostles and that sort of people. And they believe that when he says, "I also received" here, he's referring to that first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. And then he adds this additional comment, then he appeared to James, and then he adds the additional comment, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. And what we don't see in our English translations, which Greek scholars can see, is that the wording and the structure of this particular passage is structured like a creed. It's structured like something that some people would memorize and repeat in the early church. So they believe then that this creed probably dates from somewhere within a few months to a couple of years or so after the death of Christ. So this is when this creed apparently begins to be used. And one of the reasons they date it that way is we know the passage itself was written about 54 to 55 AD. This is when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, okay? But the creed itself is much earlier. So Paul is reciting a creed, which he tells us there in verse 1, that he received when he went to Jerusalem the first time. So this puts the creed within about 2 to 3 years of the crucifixion resurrection date, all right? And even, for example, Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic or an atheist Jesus scholar, he dates it within 6 months of the crucifixion. So this creed is dated very, very early. And there are several things to note about the creed. As I mentioned, Paul preached it to the Corinthians in about 50 AD. But he received the creed sometime in the mid-30s, okay? And that by that time, others were already preaching the creed. So it's not a creed that was created at that point, but it's a creed that was already being used in the worship services of the church by the mid-30s. So this message was already being preached. In addition to that, the creed states that over 500 people simultaneously witnessed a post-mortem appearance of Jesus. So you have in Jerusalem a creed being recited in the church referring to 500 people who have had a post-mortem experience with Jesus. So So if this were somehow unfounded belief, there wasn't evidence for it, certainly this would be unexplainable. So this is just one of the additional things that just begs for explanation. Another one that people point to is the conversion of Paul. How do you account for the conversion of Paul? He was, of course, a very early opponent of Christianity. He was violently opposed to Christianity. He did not believe in the resurrection. And then he had some kind of an experience, which he says was an actual encounter with the risen Christ. And so he has this experience, which then converts him to Christianity, and he becomes a Christian. Scholars recognize that he had some kind of profound experience that changed him in this dramatic way. And he actually Paul claims it was an actual encounter with Christ. So he doesn't say it was a vision. He doesn't claim that it was an hallucination. He doesn't claim it was a dream. And it's important to realize that these concepts are available. The New Testament talks about visions. The New Testament talks about dreams. So if it was in fact a vision or a dream, and Paul understood it that way, he had the terminology to use to explain it that way, but he doesn't. He calls it an actual encounter with the risen Christ. Then there's the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus. Of course, we know that prior to Jesus' death, he, along with other family members, thought Jesus was a little touched in the head, right? But then he has some kind of encounter that creed in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about. He has some kind of an encounter, and he becomes not just a follower of Christ, but he actually becomes a leader within the church. These are things that historians of all persuasions recognize as historical facts. Okay?
Real quick on that. So if I'm discussing with someone, a non-believer, if they say, well, but back, so the scholars are all studying things, and those writers back then are all in cahoots, or they're all in it together. So this is not just based on only our Bible. This is all this. Is there like, I'm just trying to figure out how to argue this in a way that this is, scholars recognize all the literature and all that.
Yes.
Biblical and non-biblical.
Yes.
All points. There are not.
This is why
this is an entire body of evidence that says no, this is not happening. This has been refuted.
Yes, that's why I mentioned at the beginning,
right,
that we're building on other things we've talked about, the credibility of the Gospels as historical documents and that sort of thing, which historians of all persuasions now recognize.
It's not just only the books of the Bible they're using. They're excluding everything else. They're trying to include everything, but look at the body of evidence and say.
Yes, that's true. So you have secular writers referring to for example, the crucifixion,
sure,
the resurrection claims, the post-mortem appearances, okay, and that sort of thing. You have early church writers. You have Roman historians. So you have other sources. The primary sources remain the Gospels.
Sure, you bet.
Okay, and that's why I said at the beginning, we've already established the historicity of the Gospels, which most scholars accept. And you'll see how this proceeds as we go along here today. Okay. Another significant fact that needs explanation is the days of worship for many devout Jews suddenly changes from Saturday to Sunday. What caused that? Then, of course, there's the suffering and martyrdom of the apostles. Most of the apostles, of course, suffered greatly. Most of them, with the exception of John, we believe were martyred. John, of course, suffered greatly, but didn't suffer martyrdom. And they did so because of their belief in the resurrection. And of course, we know that people die all the time for things they believe that are false. Okay, so that's not particularly significant. And people oftentimes just die believing false things. They may die from COVID-19 and believe Martians landed on the Earth or whatever. So people oftentimes believe false things and die, and people oftentimes die for false beliefs, but they believe they're true. What we have with the disciples is where they are actually dying for the belief of the resurrection. And that's just something that doesn't happen. People don't die for something they know to be false. So if it was fraudulent, how do you account for the death of the apostles for that belief? Then, of course, just the birth of Christianity. How do you explain the birth of this new religion when, as we've pointed out, the primary message of Christianity is the crucifixion, which was such an offensive message to people, and the resurrection, which nobody believes happened. Okay, how do you account for the birth of Christianity? So the eyewitness testimony that first century people encountered when it came to the resurrection must have been incredibly compelling to them for the church to be born. So these are just some of the things. These are just some of the things that just kind of, if you have any modicum of curiosity at all, beg for an explanation when it comes to what happened to the body of Jesus after his death. Okay. So that leads us then into and we'll come back to this list and add some more things to it here in a little bit. But this leads us to the question of then, how do we approach offering an apologetic for the resurrection? And historically, the church has had an approach where basically we're arguing from the reliability of Scripture. So this kind of comes back to your question. So historically, for millennia, the church, when people questioned the resurrection of Jesus, how did the church address that apologetic? And traditionally, it was done by arguing for the credibility of Scripture and arguing for these three things that we've talked about before: the authenticity of the Gospels, okay, so that the Gospels actually are eyewitness accounts, and establishing that they are an eyewitness account, establishing that the text has been preserved so that we do have what was originally written, and then also arguing for the historical reliability of the gospel. So this is traditionally how the church has argued their apologetic for the resurrection. This is how I learned to argue. Okay, when I was a young man, and I was in my teens and in my 20s, and I was learning how to witness and learn how to share the gospel, this is how I learned to defend the resurrection. It's a tremendously effective way. It has been for millennia. Okay, but beginning about 150 years ago or so, this approach to defending the resurrection became a little more difficult. Okay, and there were a couple reasons for that. One was the onset of higher criticism. We talked about higher criticism. We talked about its limited usefulness. It has some usefulness, but we also talked about how destructive it can be. And with the onset of higher biblical criticism, people lost their confidence in the Gospels. And so to argue the resurrection from the credibility of the Gospels alone became very difficult. Okay, and then another factor that's developed within the last century or so is the rise of subjectivism. So there's a much more of an emphasis now with people. Part of this is related to postmodernism, but other things as well. A much more of an emphasis on internal experience. So people weren't so concerned about what actually happened historically. The question is, what is my internal experience? And, that's kind of my spiritual view of the resurrection. That's what's really important. So this really caused a tendency to make the traditional apologetic more of a hill to climb for us as we attempted to share the resurrection with people, right? So you get then, interestingly enough, though, in the beginning about 1980s or so, and the last couple decades of the 20th century and on into the 20th century, you get a significant and very encouraging shift in what we call resurrection scholarship. So when I'm talking about resurrection scholarship, I'm not just talking about Christians studying the resurrection. I'm talking about scholars of all persuasions, Jews, atheists, agnostics, non-Christians, Christians. Okay, so basically any scholar studying the whole question of Jesus and the postmortem issues regarding Jesus. Okay, so you get this shift, and you get actually this kind of new era of resurrection scholarship. And what's fascinating is that Jesus historians have increasingly over the last 30 or 40 years began to acknowledge how compelling the historical data is that we possess for the resurrection. So we think about that list of things I just mentioned. I'm going to give you another list here in a few minutes. Are things which historians across the board now look at and they go, well, these things, these phenomena or these facts are well established both from the gospel records as well as from external documents and external evidence that we have as well. So that what has become characteristic now is that the people who deny the resurrection of Jesus are really on the defensive. They're having to argue very forcefully against the resurrection because the evidence just seems so compelling. So we have this interesting quote from this Jewish scholar, a guy by the name of Lapid. He died at I think in 1997 or so. He was a Jewish theologian, a Jewish scholar. He was also happened to be an Israeli diplomat. He was very influential in Israel being recognized as a state. And he makes this comment, which I think is just fascinating. He says, in regard to the future resurrection of the dead, I am and remain a Pharisee. What does he mean by that?
Resurrection at the end of the age will occur.
Okay, so the Pharisees believed in a resurrection, right? Okay, but then he says, concerning the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, I was for decades a Sadducee. What does he mean by that? The Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, right? So what he's saying, for decades, he said, I did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. He says, I am no longer a Sadducee. Now, if we read that carefully, he's not actually claiming he believes in the resurrection of Jesus. But what he's saying is he's no longer saying it couldn't have happened, okay, or that it didn't happen. And the reason Lapid and other scholars like him, even though they're non-Christians, now are much more open to the idea of the resurrection is because of the compelling nature of the evidence that's there. So that now leads us to kind of a new kind of apologetic. So in addition to the traditional apologetic, which is still a very strong and very useful and very good apologetic, in addition to that, we have now what's called the historical apologetic, and it basically has kind of two simple steps to it. First, you establish the historical facts which serve as evidence for the resurrection. So what are the facts that we have, the historical facts that most historians will go, okay, we know this happened, we know this happened, we know this phenomenon existed, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the historical facts which can serve or which do serve as some kind of evidence for the resurrection? And then the second step is to argue that the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, is the best explanation for those facts. So we're taking a body of evidence and we're asking ourselves, of the various explanations for that body of evidence, which is the best explanation? Is the resurrection of Jesus the best explanation, or one of these other explanations or hypotheses better? And there are two ways to do this. And this goes back to a lesson we had very early on when we were talking about argumentation, and we were talking about how do you look at two competing explanations for something, two hypotheses, and determine which one is the best. Okay? And I suggested there are two ways to do that. One is using Bayes' theorem. Remember that weird mathematical formula thing? Okay, so that's one way you could approach the resurrection. You could use Bayes' theorem. Okay, it does, however, have somewhat limited usefulness. In one part, very few people understand it, so it has to be somebody who understands what you're doing with Bayes' theorem. But the other reason it's difficult to use is because Bayes' theorem calls for factoring in what's called background information, and it gets very hard to measure that background information, things like the existence of God and the possibility of miracles and things like that. It gets very difficult to measure that quantitatively when you're actually talking with someone. So Bayes' theorem is available, but it has limited usefulness. The other approach that we talked about in our lesson on argumentation is inference to the best explanation. Okay, and so this is an approach that looks at things like at the various hypotheses and ask questions like, what is the explanatory power of the hypothesis? What's the explanatory scope? What's the plausibility? What's the simplicity? What level of ad hocness, and those sorts of things. So inference to the best explanation is really the better way for us to approach this when we're talking about people, because this is typically the way people think. And so they may not know this is what you're doing, but this is what they're familiar with, usually in argumentation. So using this historical approach, Gary Habermas, who's a leading Christian scholar on the subject of resurrection, leading scholar period on the subject of resurrection, has pioneered what he calls the minimal facts defense, okay? And this is, one of his students was a guy by the name of Michael Licona, who has gone on to write a masterpiece on the resurrection that's in your, is referenced in your sources material there at the beginning of your notes. And Michael Licona uses this same defense, and we'll explore that more in a minute. But basically, what the minimal facts defense does is it takes what I've always argued is the best way to persuade people of something. Okay? If you want to know how not to persuade people of something, just look at social media. Okay, you know, most people on social media, what are they doing? They're just screaming at each other, right? They're just yelling their points, and they're just, you know. But if you really want to persuade somebody of something, there's really a two-step approach that is most effective. And the first thing is you establish the points at which you agree on something. So if you encounter somebody, whatever you're talking about, whether it's politics or football or whatever it is, the best way to persuade somebody of your position is to first find out and establish what are the points at which we agree. Okay? And then you move from the points of agreement towards the points of disagreement. You try and show how your points of agreement, the things you agree on, how they give evidence for your preferred conclusion as opposed to theirs. That's the way the minimal facts defense works. Okay? So it employs this method of working from the points of agreement to the points of controversy or the points of disagreement. So what we do then with the minimal facts defense is we employ these points of agreement first. We find the points of agreement with people. And what Licona has done is he uses what he calls the historical bedrock. I talked about this term last week or the week before, okay? And by historical bedrock, what Licona means are those facts which most historians accept or maybe even unanimously accept, okay? So he looks for those places where historians have the most agreement. And then from that, he works towards establishing the resurrection. And when I say most scholars, again, I mean most scholars, whatever their persuasion. In addition to that, the minimal facts defense tends to use the New Testament text that most skeptics acknowledge as Pauline. Now, I should have also included the Gospels in here, but particularly right now what I'm concerned about are the evidences in the epistles for the resurrection, for example, in 1 Corinthians, okay? And there are many skeptics who deny Pauline authorship of some of the letters that we think of as Pauline, okay? But there are some of Paul's letters we consider Pauline, that most scholars, no matter how skeptical they are, acknowledge were Pauline letters, okay? And those are 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, okay? So what the minimal facts defense does is it takes those historical facts that most scholars agree on, and it uses, when it's using Pauline epistles and Pauline writings, it only uses those that most scholars recognize as being sourced from Paul, okay? Now, it's very important that we keep a couple things in mind here. One is that if there's a body of evidence that I can use, and I choose to only use a limited part of that body of evidence because those are the only parts you agree with. If I choose only to use those, that doesn't mean that I don't think the others are historical. Okay. So limiting myself to just part of the evidence is not conceding that the other evidence is not valid. All right. It's just making a strategic decision that in my argument, I'm just going to rely on the things that I don't have to argue with you about. I'm going to start with the things I don't have to argue with you about or don't have to persuade you of. And similarly, if I choose to only use certain Pauline epistles because I know the person I'm talking to accepts those as Pauline, that doesn't concede that the other epistles are not Pauline. I'm not saying the others aren't Pauline. I'm just saying these are the ones you know are Pauline. So if I'm going to argue from Paul, I'm going to use the ones that you recognize Pauline. So again, it's just this principle of starting from our point of agreement and moving towards our point of disagreement. So what do we have to work with? Well, I gave you a list of 9 things earlier, but Habermas actually points out 12 specific things that the vast majority of scholars agree on, okay? So, as we've already established a couple of weeks ago, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. They agree that he was buried in a tomb. Most of them agree it was the tomb of Josephus. That his death caused his disciples to despair, that his tomb was empty. And you'll notice here I marked this as the most contested point. Okay, so this is the one that scholars are the most inclined to question. But remember, I already showed you that 75% of scholars say the tomb was empty. So when I'm saying it's the most contested point, what that implies is that on all these other points, there's more than 75% of scholars agree on. And some of them they're unanimous on, okay? Number 5, the disciples had experiences they believe were post-mortem physical appearances. Number 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers. Number 7, the resurrection was their central message that they preached, and they preached that message in Jerusalem, which was the easiest place to disprove it. The church was born and grew. That seems pretty obvious, but that's something that all scholars agree on. The church came into existence there in the early to mid part of the 1st century and grew quite rapidly. They agree that Orthodox Jews changed their primary day of worship from Saturday to Sunday. They agree that Jesus' brother James became a believer after a personal encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and they believe the conversion of Paul after he saw what he claimed to be the resurrection of Jesus. These are 12 points that the vast majority of scholars of all persuasions, historical Jesus scholars of all persuasions, agree on, even the atheists, okay? So when it comes then to using the minimal facts defense, and we have this body of 12 things, okay, this gives us a great deal of flexibility in how we can argue for the resurrection. So, for example, in reasonable faith, William Lane Craig picks only 3 things, all right? So he picks the empty tomb. Of those 12 things, he takes the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. And in his masterpiece, Reasonable Faith, he argues persuasively for the resurrection on just those 3 things. And he does this in part by looking, as I mentioned, looking at the other explanations for just these 3 things and showing that the other explanations for these 3 facts, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith, fail in comparison to the resurrection as an explanation for those 3 things. All right, and we'll explore how this works in just a minute. And then Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Christ, interviews Mike Licona. And in his interview with Licona points out 4 things that he uses as he makes a defense for the resurrection. So he uses the death of Christ by crucifixion, the disciples' belief in post-mortem appearances, the conversion of Paul, and the conversion of James. I think this is really fascinating, so I just get sidetracked a little bit, is that scholars are so struck by the conversion of James. And one of the reasons James comes out as such a strong historical argument is because he's mentioned by non-biblical writers. For example, Josephus talks about James as one of the leaders of the church. And so at any rate, in his interview with Lee Strobel, he uses these 4 facts from that list of 12 that we used, and he argues forcefully for the resurrection just using those 4 facts. But then in Lacona's own book, when he writes In the Resurrection of Jesus, excuse me, he goes back to what, as I mentioned, he calls the historical bedrock. And for his book, he defines the historical bedrock just extremely stringent. So he defines historical bedrock as those facts on which the historical scholars are unanimous. Okay. So he's looking for unanimity out of those 12 things listed, all right? And he finds 3 points at which all scholars, he says, are unanimous in their agreement. And the 3 he chooses are Jesus' death by crucifixion, multiple post-mortem appearances, and the conversion of Paul. So he says all scholars agree on these 3 things, right? And then he sets out to write a 700-page defense of the resurrection just on those 3 points. Actually, it's only the last half of his book he actually gets to the defense, because he's talking about historicity and how we do history and all that sort of thing in the earlier part of the book. Okay. So what I want you to notice is how each one of these authors approaches the minimal facts defense differently. They use different facts, okay? And this is one of the reasons I like the minimal facts defense, because when I'm talking to somebody, I can find out what are the facts that they're most inclined to agree with, and I can focus on those. So if they agree that the early church preached the resurrection, and if they agree that people thought they saw the resurrected Christ, and if they agree the tomb was empty, then I can ask them, how do you explain those things? How do you account? What is your hypothesis? What is your explanation for just those 3 facts? Okay, and then I can give my explanation for those 3 facts, and we can weigh and we can compare those hypotheses. Okay, so this takes us back then again to this arguing or making an argument using inference to the best explanation. And just by way of review, I gave you a handout back when we did that lesson, clear back at the first part of the year. And typically the criteria that are used when you're looking for the best explanation are explanatory scope, explanatory power, simplicity, plausibility, less ad hoc, in accord with other already accepted beliefs, and then comparative superiority, which hypothesis is superior or more superior on those points than other hypotheses. And that's how you weigh and determine which hypothesis appears to be the best explanation, okay? Now, when Lacona does this, he uses a little bit different criteria. He kind of blends some together. But the criteria he uses, are explanatory scope. And what he means by that is how many facts does the hypothesis explain? So, for example, the swoon theory. Okay, so the swoon theory, Jesus swooned and then he recovered in the tomb, and either he was removed from the tomb or he escaped from the tomb. Okay, well, that explains the tomb. But that doesn't explain the birth of the church. That doesn't explain the conversion of Paul. That doesn't explain the encounters of Mary or Peter or James with the risen Christ, okay? So it lacks scope. That's one of the major problems with the swoon theory, is it just lacks explanatory scope. Okay, there are things it doesn't explain. Then explanatory power. How well does the hypothesis explain the facts? So, for example, oftentimes hallucination is used as an explanation for the appearances. But there are significant problems with how well it does that. Okay, there are problems with psychoanalyzing people in ancient history, and there's problems with just assumptions about what their psychological state was and that sort of thing. So explanatory power has to do with how persuasively does a particular argument address the question. Plausibility, the hypothesis is implied to a greater degree by a greater variety of other accepted truths. So how well does this fit with what else we know? Less ad hoc, what he means by that is it possesses fewer non-evidence assumptions. So, for example, when arguments are made based on hallucinations, what the person promoting that argument is often doing is they're making assumptions about the mental state of people for which they have no evidence. Okay, so it's a non-evidence assumption. It makes the argument ad hoc. All right. And then illumination, Lacona puts much less emphasis on this, but he includes it, which is it sheds more light on other related issues. So these are the criteria that he uses. And then what he does is he takes 5 of the leading skeptical scholars. So these are 5 highly recognized, highly credible, credentialed scholars. And he looks and he explores, and he does this in his book. He explores their arguments. What are their arguments? How do they explain the 3 facts that he accepts as bedrock? So they were the crucifixion, the multiple appearances, and the conversion of Paul. Those are his 3 facts. And he asks, so how does Giza-Vermes, how does he address that question? What are his hypotheses? How does he explain those 3 facts? And one of the problems with Vermes is he's very agnostic about the possibility of historically analyzing the resurrection at all. So he tends to be very dismissive of any historical approach to it. Okay, but he tends to view the experiences of the risen Christ as these kind of mystical experiences, and that's his explanation. And as Lacona points out, he doesn't really address the conversion of Paul very well. There's other things he doesn't address, so it lacks explanatory scope, it lacks power, and it lacks plausibility. Then we have Michael Golder. He gives psychological explanations, hallucinations, delusions, things like that. And here again, the problem with Golder's arguments is they lack power and plausibility because he relies a lot on psychoanalyzing somebody in ancient history. And historians have become very loath to do that. Historians now recognize how difficult it is to psychoanalyze somebody today, let alone somebody from 2,000 years ago, right? And yet he does this a great deal. And he has developed quite a theory on what was Peter's frame of mind when he saw what was Paul's frame of mind when he had the thing. And that's just very, very difficult to do. Then Gerd Ludemann, who is an avowed atheist, he also relies on hallucinations and ecstasy as the explanation for the multiple appearances. And so again, it's lacking explanatory power and plausibility, and he has some unevidenced assumptions as well.
It's a bad mushroom.
Pardon?
It's a bad mushroom.
Yeah, really, really. And then there's John Dominic Crossman. You may be familiar with him from the Jesus Seminar. He thinks the empty tomb was invented by Mark. So there was no empty tomb. He's one of the ones who rejects the empty tomb. But you remember, the empty tomb is not part of Lacona's list of 3 things. So he isn't even arguing for the empty tomb, all right? Trances and altered states of consciousness is his account for things like Paul's experience and the multiple appearances. And so once again, it fails in power and plausibility and is ad hoc. And then we get kind of an unusual case is Peter Crawford. And Peter Crawford is a postmodernist, okay? So he takes kind of a semi-postmodern view. So it's kind of a mixture of modernism and postmodernism. So he argues for altered states of consciousness. The corpse is still in the grave, again, which is not an issue that Lacona is building on. He doesn't address Paul's conversion at all. So it lacks an explanatory scope, it lacks an explanatory power, plausibility, and it has ad hoc features. So Lacona's point is that to varying degrees, each of these alternate explanations that are given by the leading scholars of the day, the leading skeptical scholars of the day, okay? So this is not just some, freshman college student that you encounter over on campus, right? These are the people who've really studied the stuff, and they've given their best shot at discrediting the resurrection. That their explanations, their hypotheses are significantly deficient compared to the hypothesis of the resurrection. The only reason to reject the hypothesis of the resurrection is it calls for a miracle. Okay? Is that it is a miracle, and we claim and we acknowledge and admit that it is a miracle. Okay? But keep in mind, just looking at Lacona's work here, that Lacona is only using 3 of the 12 things on our list. We have all these other things that we can use as well. So we really do have just a tremendous amount of evidence for the resurrection, and good reason to believe in it. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about Paul's belief in a physical resurrection, because there are scholars who call into question whether Paul really believed in a physical resurrection. I'm not going to cover that today. It's in your notes, so you can go over it. And I may take some time at the beginning next week of next week's lesson to look at that. So let's just fast forward here because we're about out of time. So then the question is, after what we looked at last week, how is resurrection understood? What did the church mean by it? And the question this week is, historically, did Jesus rise from the dead? And what we see from the evidence is that the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus remains, as it has for 2 millennia, the best explanation for all this body of facts we have. And this is why so many people in the first century world became Christians, because the evidence was just so compelling. But keep in mind, we're not arguing that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. We're not arguing for a natural resurrection. And this is what we have to get in people's minds. We're not trying to explain how Jesus arose naturally from the dead. We believe it was a miracle. We believe that God raised him from the dead. And on that point, just keep in mind the things we talked about how do you identify a miracle? You identify a miracle in partly by the charged religious context in which it occurred. So with the resurrection of Jesus, we have this atmosphere, this environment, this context in which this supposed event occurred. And that is that Jesus claimed to be Messiah. He claimed to be God. That he was, as we saw, a miracle worker, an exorcist, and as we saw, many historians recognize that he was in fact a wonder worker. He made predictions of his own death and his resurrection, and he was crucified for his religious claims, but before he was crucified, he claimed that his resurrection would be his vindication. So he claimed ahead of time that he would rise again from the dead. So it's in this very charged atmosphere then that we have to view all this data that we have, these 12 things and more. The 12 things are just the things that Habermas points out that historians are all in agreement in. But if you just take those 12 things and you put those 12 things in this context, then we have strong reason to believe not only that Jesus rose from the dead, but that it was in fact a miracle performed by God as a vindication of Jesus and his message, okay? So next week, we'll probably go back and touch on the question about Paul briefly, and then we want to look at the actual stories in the Gospels about what happened on Easter morning and kind of wrestle through those because people have all kinds of questions about that. And then think a little bit about the meaning of the resurrection. So there you go.
Cool stuff.
See you next week. We do have, like I said, a few extra weeks. Again, if you have something that's on your mind or some questions on your mind that you'd like to take part of a lesson or a lesson and address, let me know and we'll do that. I do have at least one or two videos that are very helpful videos that if we have time, I'd like for us to watch, and if I can figure out the technology of doing it in here and on Zoom at the same time. There are some videos to watch. So I have some things for us to do. But again, if you have some particular issues that you'd like us to address that we haven't addressed or that we didn't address to your satisfaction, let me know and give me a little time to prepare, and we'll try to cover some of those things. So that's it for today.